Hi, I want to welcome you all to the next series of our Making Sense of Complexity, next lecture in this with Professor Marco Janssen. Marco is a professor in the School of Sustainability and the School of Complex Adaptive Systems. He has a background in mathematics, but has done various kinds of modeling, agent-based and participatory modeling for many years. He's the director for the Center for Behavior Institutions and the Environment, and also co-director of the Network for Computational Modeling and Social and Ecological Sciences. And most important, Marco is one of the leading experts in ostromology. That is the building on the work of Lynn Ostrom to try and understand and represent and model how people work together to solve collective action problems and successfully manage common pool resources. And I think his talk is going to focus on some of these issues today. So thanks, Marco. Happy to have you here.
Thank you, Michael. I will actually thank you for all coming on this Friday morning. I will mainly talk about experimental work. I think I have only one slide about models, but this will provide a discuss different experimental papers that we have been doing and still doing, where we are interested in studying the conditions for self-governance of the commons. And if there are clarifying questions, that will be good to have that during the talk. I will probably not see anything in the comments, but Michael may mention that that's happening. So although the comments might be familiar to everyone, the definition is not always clear. I'd like to more likely talk about shared resources. So here some examples: land, water, fisheries, etc. But also we are increasingly this focus on knowledge commons, knowledge shared resources in terms of knowledge and space, outer space. So a lot of the ideas about shared resources and how to manage them get in the last years applied to a lot of different topics than originally done. And but what was the kind of some of the earlier discussions? So okay, so in '68, Garrett Hardin popularized the idea of the tragedy of the commons, and his key point was to avoid the tragedy, one needs to use privatization or naturalization of the commons. So those were the kind of two solutions that would be needed to avoid overuse of shared resources. And this kind of I think his paper is well known. It's still one of the most assigned kind of readings in also in classes in college. There's a whole issue about his particular kind of scholarship. I will not go into that, but key important is that his information was his statement. He was a biologist, and he made it was basically his an opinion piece, not a scholarly article. But it was largely used also in policy domain, and a lot of people have been working after that, anthropologists, sociologists, economists, to study cases around the world and will show that people can manage their shared resources without privatization or nationalization. So Lynn Ostrom wrote the book Governing the Commons, in which she kind of synthesized a lot of that work and provide a more theoretical framework, as provide an alternative view that people can successfully manage their shared resources. It's not that it is the only way. You have all these different possibilities. So I focus more on a behavioral perspective. So and so that's why when I talk about the factors that improve self-governance relate more to behavioral aspects. So self-governance is not always happening if communities get the opportunity, and it's also not always successful. But what we know from a lot of the studies, especially also experimental work, is that if you allow people to communicate, that leads to much better performance. If you allow people to sanction others, even without monetary sanctioning, that can be effective. Allowing people to create their own rules. And well, Lynn Ostrom presented the design principles in her Governing the Commons as key factors that explain successful communities. There is an endless list of factors. That's the challenge. There are a lot of contextual factors. So what I will be focusing are a number of more specific questions. What are some of these social and economic conditions that can facilitate self-governance, and why is actually communication effective? It's not really clear why that is the case. There are a number of explanations, and we will discuss some of that. There is not that much work done on how collective action is impacted by uncertainty and disturbances. That's some of our current work and some work in the past. And if you talk about self-governance, how can we stimulate self-governance? If self-governance is desirable, how can we stimulate it? You cannot impose self-governance in a way. That's a challenge. So I will first talk about some experiments related to spatial dynamics. Then I will include some power differences. Then I go to study on risk and globalization. Then the use of games as intervention tools. And then I will talk about current research of uncertainty. So the first type of experiments we talk about is experiments we started doing in 2005. And we are using a virtual environment in which participants can move around their kind of avatar in using a renewable resource, and they get kind of a little financial reward for every little token they collect. And they can, depending on the conditions, we allow them to chat with each other, whether they can use sanctioning. We don't use the term sanction, but they can reduce the earnings of others. And let me show kind of some videos to get an idea of what is happening. So these are behaviors. This is not an agent-based model. These are actual humans who are moving their avatar on the screen. And the top one is where without communication. The bottom is with communication. It's the same group, but this is in a way after they were allowed to communicate. They know how long the experiment lasts. It's 4 minutes, at least each round. And so you will see that this will take less than 4 minutes. So they will end up looking at a black screen for 2.5 minutes. And if you then do this again, they do the same thing. So it's, and this is without communication. We have now done this with hundreds of groups, and it's almost always the same thing. If you allow them to communicate, then they don't overharvest. So you may say, well, that's obvious because now they are coordinating. That's not obvious, actually. Often they are not, if they communicate, they are not really talking about what they should do. They may talk about a football match that happened last weekend. They may not really talk about strategies in detail. So it's not always clear why that is the case. Okay, so let me go to the next slide. Okay, so we see that without communication, the resource size declines very quickly. And then the total number of harvested tokens is not as high that if you could communicate. If you allow people to punish, they use that sometimes, not that much, but they can use that, but it has not really a beneficial effect. One of the reasons we asked participants why they used or didn't use it, and they were afraid for counter punishment, which if people use punishment, they were, in a way, there was retaliation. So in this environment, communication was very effective, but costly punishment was not effective. So now a change that you can make in the environment is that people may not see everything. And so that's a kind of manipulation. And so what will be the impact of less information? So one of the reasons that people say they are over-harvesting in the beginning, when they cannot communicate, is that other people, they harvested a lot, so they had to do that too. So, and that's indeed what we will see when there is less information of others. We see a kind of a delay in over-harvesting because they not immediately saw other people were harvesting as much. But with communication, it becomes more difficult because you may have some agreements and you may not see what other people are doing. And so we did different manipulations, and we still see, if we make it very difficult to communicate, there's still, we see a significant increase of performance with communication, even though it might be just a few messages, if they can only send messages to each other when they can see the avatar of others. So we try to get a better understanding about why people, in a way, show cooperative behavior. And I started working with Daniel De Caro, who was a postdoc at Indiana University and is now a professor in the University of Louisville. He's a psychologist by training, and he focuses on procedural justice. So what is done during the experiment, we do a number of surveys, different places. And in this experiment, we are looking at what will be the impact if we let people choose between rules, or whether rules will be imposed, whether they could use enforcement or not enforcement. And we measure different attitudes towards these rules and before and after they experience those rules. So what was interesting is that if you allow voting, this leads to a sharp increase of performance, especially if they could also use enforcement. If you impose the same rules that did not have a kind of a change of these rules were all rules that were based on rules that we had seen in communication experiments that they were interested to pursue. So key is that if you impose a rule that is not seen as a kind of a procedural just approach, and they will not follow those kind of imposed rules. And if voting is allowed, but there's no enforcement, we see that those who did not vote for those rules and were not in favor of those rules are more likely not to follow those rules. So that's why voting and enforcement is important. And let's see, have some delays in my, okay. Here we see that the winning voters, they have a we have a higher acceptance of the rules than the losing. We also measure desirable rules for imposed. So only when there is voting and enforcement, those who elected the rules will benefit. Because if there is no enforcement, then those who didn't vote for the rules, they were breaking the rule, and if there's no enforcement, they were in a way the ones who benefited. So, so this was kind of an example of that it's not really about the specific rules, but the process that led to those rules. So now we have doing a set of experiments where we focus on different types of communication. So here is one of the paper that came out early this year. We look at the first few rounds is without communication, then we have communication, and we do again, and then we have the third phase is without communication. But we still see that the amount of harvesting is high compared to the baseline. So they keep having a high level of performance, and so which is interesting that it doesn't go back. And so we are measuring all kind of aspects related to kind of how they perceive this process. So there's a high level of experience of procedural justice. We also look at, we see the increased amount of trust in each other, and especially those who had a high level of trust in each other after the rounds of communication, they continue to do well in the phase 3 when communication was dropped again. Not all groups, when they could communicate, did well. And there is if there are groups who are not doing well at all, and if you look at the communication, they are using shaming instead of praising each other. And so how you communicate is important. And Daniel and the students, they use 28 different categories to look at all the communication messages, and the key factor was basically the type of the sentiment of the information. It's not what they are talking about, but how they are talking with each other. So these are some examples of the 41 different groups, how this goes over the 9 rounds. So you see that without communication, they all kind of collapse, strategy of the commons. Then after the 3rd round, they could start communicating, and you see a higher level of performance. So this is also data we use to test an agent-based model on this experimental data. So we developed an agent-based model where we include elements of trust. So trust was impacted by how much they observed the inequality of tokens that were collected during the round, and the communication, if communication was allowed, and that the trust impacted how fast in a way they move. The less trust they have, the faster they move. That's also what we see in the data, and how likely they are harvesting tokens. So if we only have selfish or altruistic agents, we have 51% fit of the data. And if we include a third type, which is more conditional cooperator, with these different levels of how trust impacts their harvesting decisions, then we get to 84%. If we have a fourth type of agent, then we go to 86. So it's really the key factor is that including one additional type of conditional cooperator is key. This is in line with other studies that use simpler games where they can more kind of better identify directly from their actions what people did. So conditional cooperation. And this model structure is really based on a behavioral model that Lynn Austin proposed in the 90s to explain experimental observations, and we now, in a way, tested that in more detail on the experimental data. An interesting thing that happens is that these spatial games also start being used by Deepmind, which is a deep learning company. You may know about them because they created a deep learning application to beat the Go master, the world champion of Go. But they are using this game and variation of this game to create agents who cooperate in these kind of situations. It's it's an interesting kind of. It's also interesting to see how much resources they have compared to the little resources we have for doing this kind of work. So I was a little bit jealous to see that a company is doing a lot of additional work. And they also grow neural networks that explain observed patterns. But important is that the work we do in the agent-based model tries to test hypotheses on the mechanisms we think are going on. The neural networks application is not necessary. It works, but it's not necessarily explaining kind of hypothesis we have. Okay, I'm now going to a different kind of game, which is more focused on power differences. So this game was initially created for field experiments that we did. We did various type of resource games in different countries. And the irrigation game was interesting because we have the power difference between when people can extract from the resource. So that first they have to invest in infrastructure. And then we get inequality of who is first to extract from it. So you have upstream versus downstream in the resource. So also here we have 5 players. In the first, you get a kind of an endowment, and how much do you keep and how much do you invest in the public infrastructure. And then you create a kind of a resource, and then that resource you have one player is first to extract from it. And in the field experiments, they could take, the first player could take everything. And then you go to the second player who knows what the first player did, but the third player didn't know what the 2 individuals exactly did before they knew how much was left over. So what happened, this is how those games were implemented. We saw that there was, independent of the position, A was the upstream, the contribution was very much the same, but the extraction was very unequal. And and this was a pattern we saw in the different countries where we have done these experiments, Thailand and Colombia. And so we continued these experiments also in the lab. We are interested, okay, we see this with in the field, let's do some more experiments. So we did in the lab, we could make it a little bit more complicated, where we could, the participants could open and close their gates in a way when they had water. So it was more not all or nothing, or the amount they could more real time. They had a number of seconds in which it was the season, and they could then, after they had created the resource, they could then they could first have to they could block in that way. If they opened the gates, then that water didn't go to those downstream. You see that here with C, they open the gate, the water goes to C, and that well, there's not less water available for D and E. Actually, you may wonder why would those undergraduate ASU students be understanding this, because they are not farmers. That's true. We initially did these experiments with downloading files because that will be, we thought that will be more in tune with their understanding, and they had to create bandwidth, etc. But people didn't understand that they had no bandwidth. So they were all complaining that the system didn't work because if they click on downloading, it didn't work. So, but it was more clearly to understand that if you open a gate and water didn't move forward, that was clear to understand. So the context, how you explain the experiment, is really a critical factor. What I wanted to indicate here too, I will not go to all the kind of experiments, but also here we did experiments where we changed the information people had with whom they could communicate. So the basic experiments was they could all communicate with each other and they could all see everybody's decisions. And we contrasted to a situation that A could only communicate with B and only see all what B did. And then C could do that with B and D. And that's more kind of, reality is more kind of a mixture, but it was a way to see, would there be an impact of how information impacted decisions. We saw a big difference when people saw all the information from each other. You saw more closely, the amount of investment was more closely to each other. If people didn't see the decisions from everyone, we saw that the downstream didn't really invest that much. And when everybody saw each other, we saw the people upstream complaining that those who downstream didn't invest that much, so they were pressured upon. And those downstream, they say, well, you have to give us water too, otherwise we will not invest. So they were negotiating. In the field experiments, we had no communication, so that might be important to explain. But here we allow communication, and we saw that if it becomes difficult to communicate and difficult to see all the information, was more inequality. So that was so in that way, the biophysical context really had a major impact on the outcome. Another set of experiments where they could all see each other, communicate with each other, but now we included variability and we included shocks to the system. So the first 10 rounds was kind of a steady, but no shocks to the system, so that was more predictable. But then in rounds 11 to 20, we allowed different shocks in terms of whether the infrastructure was reduced or the water availability was not a steady amount. And so what was interesting from this study was the impact of what happened in the first 10 rounds on the second 10 rounds. So the inequality of what people experienced in the first 10 rounds impacted the decisions made in the second 10 rounds. So if there was inequality of extractions in the first 10 rounds, when everything was more predictable, then when these disturbances happened and people upstream needed the help of the people downstream did not contribute if there was more inequality. So this is in that way might be relevant for a lot of challenges that we may have, that this inequality may have important impact in the long term when this help is needed. Okay, so we wanted to apply this irrigation game to another study in other and more different countries, especially related to uncertainty. well, to risk, to be more precise. But we ended up with a simpler game to apply this to a large number of communities. And the motivation of this study was that a lot of the work of Lynn Ostrom on studying all these case studies was that they were in relative isolated cases with maybe stable disturbance regimes and probably a lot of equality. But nowadays, a lot of these communities are getting connected to markets. There's more variability, and actually these disturbance regimes are changing. So one of our hypotheses that there's increasing fragility of those small-scale communities. These communities which were icons of success might be very fragile to the change that are happening related to climate change and globalization. So, and we did then a set of field experiments in Nepal, Thailand, Colombia, China. We went to about 120 small-scale rice-producing irrigation systems. Even in Colombia, we had those. Colombia is included because one of our key collaborators, Juan Camilo Cardenas, who's a well-known field experimenter, was part of the team. And we were interested to see whether communities were more isolated from the market, whether they have a higher level of cooperation. And we did different types of, we did some different tasks where they had different types of risk. And we did some strategy games, public good games, and we measured different types of risk aversion. So here are some of the where we did experiments. When I show this in these countries, they say, yeah, but you haven't done the experiments in our country, in our communities. Yes, that will be quite difficult to do, but we are pretty confident that yeah, the results are not outliers. So the baseline is that we had one experiment in each community. So we had to have an experiment that could be done with different group sizes. So the idea is that if everybody earns a token in the irrigation system, if you, in a way, if you invest the token in the irrigation system, then you will earn for every token that is invested. So if 20 people invest in the irrigation system, you get 20 tokens. If you keep the token, you get this $20 that were invested in the irrigation system, but if you keep your own token, you will earn additional 8. And so this could be done with, we had some communities that were illiterate, so we had to do a game that could be easily done with variable group sizes with people who were not literate. So the baseline was that typically 70–80% of the participants invested that token in the group. And we had some groups with rounds, with the yellow round and the blue round. So if the yellow round was related to private risk. So let's see. No, this is with kind of community. So everybody earns kind of how much you get from the public goods is not 1 for sure. It's 0 or 2. So there's uncertainty there. And the blue round is that you don't know for sure what you get of what if you keep the token. It could be 0. It could be 16. So we have kind of risk related to the public good or risk related to the keeping the token. So we also measured risk aversion via the traditional kind of lottery questions about what kind of lottery do you prefer. And so we did a lot of additional measurements that we tried to collect to find what explains the data. So it took more than a year to do these experiments in different places. And in the end, when we got all the data, we had the same kind of effect in these different places. So that was good to see. But the relative effects are the same. Colombia is always lowest in the amount of cooperation for, well, interesting reasons, probably. So the key finding is to say what's the impact of how the groups are related to the market. So the more the percentage of crops that they're producing, how the percentage of crops they're producing is for the market, that's higher. So they are more integrated with the market. We see less investment in a public good. And if we look at food produced in their own community, is not exactly reversed, but there we see the more they are producing food in their own community, the more they invest in their public good. We also see that the more they are, their population relates to has outside wage labor, the less they are investing in the public goods when there is group risk. So I want to mention two things. So one is that a lot of these communities, when they are integrated with the market, then they still have their irrigation going on, but they may hire, say in Thailand, they may hire somebody from Myanmar who is taking care of the farm, or there might be some other family members, and they will be taxi drivers in Bangkok. And so that gives us then better earnings. So they become part of the market. They also may start, more likely to start having crop insurance. They get familiar with that. So that's why we were expecting this effect on group risk. The people who are more integrated with the markets, they start becoming less depending on their community and use other kind of ways to mitigate risk because they get familiar with insurance. They don't need to invest in their group. So some people may wonder, say, hey, this looks quite different than the work of Joe Henry. At least some of the reviewers, when we submitted to Nature, they would say, hey, this is in contrast to what Joe Henry found. So this cannot be true. Well, this is, well, there are different things to say about that, but this is quite different experiment. In Joe Henry's work, he showed that the more people are connected with the market, the higher there's cooperation with strangers. In our case, they knew who was in their group, and gain was framed as investing in their irrigation system in their community. So this was a very different kind of game than a ultimatum game with an unknown other person. So we were not surprised that we found this reverse effect. Okay, so yeah, so the conclusion is the more you have market integration, the less you have cooperation in these framed public good experiments. So the results are statistically significant. Might not be, in a way, it's difficult to make wild extrapolations, but our interpretation is that the globalization makes that the small scale communities are less able to deal with issues like climate change. So that's But yeah, it's difficult to make that that at least confirm this is our hypothesis that was confirmed. It's difficult to really make a big claim on this, but that it at least suggests that that still is on the table. Now, how do we apply some of these findings? Because you cannot impose self-governance. So we are using games as intervention tool. This is work that we are doing with, mainly other people, but I'm involved with collaborating with IFPRI, International Food Policy Research Institute, and the Indian NGO Foundation for Ecological Security. We tested whether if we use games, grounds of the game, that it will impact their behavior, where they become more water wise. The game relates to what crops to plant. And we have measured that if we do these kind of experiments, then when we come back a year later, we have different changes in mental models that are not observed in communities where we were not doing those experiments. And the NGO has been playing this, of using this for a lot of communities since then. And they found that in about half of the case, or 40% of the cases, people will start discussing changes in practice they could do. Like drip irrigation or changes in vegetation, that's in a way not something that we impose again. That's they see what, better understand what the problem is and what might be potential solutions. So this is how things are going in the field. So we also, because the NGO didn't like to use monetary incentives for individuals, so we found that that was not really impacting the outcomes. And currently, with funding from German Ministry of Development, it's scaled up to 3,500 villages. Well, it started early last year. Of course, it's impacted by the COVID situation, but some work is still going on. So the idea is that also to train people in extension workers that they will use as part of the toolkit. And it's not only the game, it's famous. The game is a starting point for a number of other activities like debriefing. So now the last thing I would like to mention, it's a project that we have now. It's focused more on uncertainty. So we had risk, in which that was when you know the probability of events. Now this is a game where you don't know what's going to happen. So the idea is, and how I came to this is, this is not something I came up with, but I was invited to participate in Interplanetary Initiative project. And so the idea is to your game to be the first generation of settlers on Mars, and there are shared resources there too, and you have to make decisions. So I will show a little clip to give you an idea what it is about.
Ever dream of living on another planet? Come play in the Mars Madness Tournament. Welcome to Port of Mars, a game-based social science experiment for the future of space exploration. Play as one of 5 members of the first human community on Mars: researcher, entrepreneur, politician, pioneer, or curator. Cooperate to keep the community alive while competing to gather the most accomplishment points to win. Mars is a deadly and uncertain environment. Expect the unexpected. Chat with other players to plan strategy and make trades. Invest in system health to keep your community alive, or invest in influence, science, finance, government, legacy, and culture to purchase accomplishment points. The player with the most points at the end of the game wins. But if system health falls to 0, everyone dies. No one wins if everyone is dead. Winning players go on to compete against other winners in the tournament to determine the Port of Mars champion, make Mars history, while creating a thriving community on the hostile red planet. Sign up to play Port of Mars today. Space is now open. Port of Mars is a social experiment for the future of space exploration. Only open.
Oh, okay, so if you may have noticed, I didn't go in all the details of the irrigation game, but it's very much based on the irrigation game. You have to invest in the infrastructure, but now there's no, in that way, inequality. Everybody can extract, well, and they have to invest their time points. So the game is more complicated than the typical games that we have done. We also work with people from the gaming industry, at least some of the former students of the PI ended up there. The idea is that this is not a game for money. A lot of traditional economic experiments are for money. It's more that it is an engaging game. And we would be interested to, in this more complex game where a lot of unknown things can happen, how people deal with those kind of situations. But to do that, we have to be able to run many groups. So initially we did we had a card game, which was fun to do, but extremely time consuming. Because we had to have a lot of moderators and often not enough people showed up. So now we have a digital version, and actually this week we hold another Mars Madness tournament. It's still a challenge to get people coming on time because it's a group experiment. You need to have a certain number of people showing up at the right time. But some interesting things already we see that participants really start to avoid events. They may have some perceptions about that these are unknown events. These are event cards that they were bad, so they try to avoid this. And we also ask questions about leadership and measure aspects about leadership. So winners are often identified as leaders, but not necessarily because leaders are more kind of altruistic. Winners often are kind of free riding a bit on the actions of others. So we are, this is now, we have, this is NSF grant, and the idea is to scale up the data collection, to analyze communication. We now will, if we do lab experiments, we just have maybe a few dozen groups. Now we may, that's the idea is to have hundreds of groups and do different kind of treatments and use text analysis to analyze the data. So we would be interested to understand why some groups survive, why others don't. And we also test what groups learn, or what individuals learn, and we will bring it to K-12. In the beginning, I mentioned that Gerrit Hanen is still taught in most high schools and colleges, and we need to provide alternative curriculum. And so that's also part of the motivation to connect this with K-12. So let's see. Okay, I want to have, okay, discussion point. So the process, in a way, of governance is key. In the beginning, when I started to work with Lynn Austin, I was really focused on the rules. We wanted to test the different type of rules and identify which rules were kind of more suitable for the problem. But in the end, we find it's more the process of governance that is key in it. You may recognize the Jedi connection. So the inequality, and that's very we find that in every study, inequality really affect the group, that how groups cooperate, and also how groups cooperate under uncertainty. So I don't really have a very positive interpretation if we want to look to current events, but we are in a way creating a misfit of the social structure and the governance challenge and the governance challenges. So because we have increasingly deal with inequality and all the polarization that doesn't help, but we have increasingly also uncertainty. And I think the COVID-19 kind of governance challenges is kind of illustrative of some of the issues. So yeah, I think we have more to say about that, but I will skip on that, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Marco. That was a great talk. Covered a really broad range of topics there. I want to open it up for comments. A couple people put things in the chat. Do you want to go ahead and express those, both Michelle and Ted? And then anybody else that would like to?
So, well, I don't know the details of irrigation in the Tempe area, but yeah, what we have been doing is normal all over the world. So it should also be, this is a very basic situation. So we are now only allow ASU undergraduates to participate in the game, and we are working. We start working on the kind of the connection with K-12 education, and Shelley Hong of the College of Education is part of the project. And but yes, more opportunities will be great.
Did you guys, either one of you guys want to follow up, Michelle or Ted?
And we use the irrigation game. I have used in high schools in the Valley too. It's an easy game to play. So if I go to a classroom, it's very easy to do. So.
Go ahead, Michelle.
I'm kind of curious about the conversation around that game, and like thinking about where it might fit for teachers and students, how they, based on the conversations around these games, how they might incorporate it into their curriculums, into things they're already to enhance and extend things they're already doing and thinking about.
Yes, so when I go to high schools and talk about the irrigation game, I connected with Colorado River challenges in terms of upstream and downstream. So what we are trying to, and you can talk about what is sustainability in a way. That's what is a desirable outcome, because if you give monetary rewards, it doesn't mean that those who get more money is necessarily better. Or so there's a discussion about what is sustainability. With the Port of Mars game, we are interested to see how people think beyond one round, because a lot of participants don't really discuss the consequences of not investing in infrastructure. This is a kind of, they may have looked too much to the DC discussion, where we have not invested in infrastructure for decades too. But because of that, they will find out when it is too late that they should have invested more in infrastructure. And that's the, and so we do some questions before and after the game to measure some about, you can relate it to also financial literacy. If you have, how much do you need to save or pay off to get a certain outcome? So those are things that we related to. So this is more about dynamical systems, thinking about dynamics.
Thanks. Ted, did you want to?
Yeah, all I wanted to comment is that it sounds like, you know, Phoenix has a unique flood irrigation infrastructure built in down to the yard level. And I know that at least in the school sustainability, we actually have some students who study some of the interesting social dynamics. And there's like these zanderos who control the gates, which are very much like the gates in your game, Marco. And apparently there's interesting social dynamics with them where people try to get them to keep the gates open for longer or for shorter, and it affects the dynamics of other people, you know, downstream and upstream. And it's very much exactly your game, but it is played out at a neighborhood scale right here in Phoenix. And so when you mentioned like, well, why didn't we use bandwidth? And, you know, because nobody's, you know, very few people are going to be farmers. Well, to me, actually, that your game was great because it actually really captured what I think is a real problem in the Phoenix area, them trying to do exactly this. So if you haven't looked into all these interesting Zaniero dynamics and all this is social, whatever, it might be a really cool example to plug in.
Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else have a question here? Go ahead and speak up if you do. I don't see any hands, but that doesn't mean I can't.
Yeah, I can't start video, but this is Xinwei.
Go ahead, Xinwei.
Hi. So really fascinating talk. Thank you. I was wondering I was wondering about financialization. In other words, late in the talk, you mentioned in passing that what was it, like money incentives did not seem to change the game outcomes, at least in some particular cases. And I was thinking earlier about whether you found other ways to how do you say this, to measure risk, investment, gain other than dollars. But in a way that's not, for example, that may allow kind of a nonlinear relationship between kind of the social value of whatever those resources are, or other kinds of social values like, you know, group cohesion, things like that, that don't get denominated.
So measuring, in a way, providing incentives is very hard for experiments because money doesn't really have the same value for everyone. The NGO in India did not want to use monetary, that we bring in money and then give different people different amounts of money. That can cause social unrest in a way. That's why we were testing whether there will be an impact. So we did not find an impact. I think also having been in quite a number of those communities, if you earn something, you will have to share it anyway. So these are small communities, everybody knows each other. So it's not that you can, but there are situations that, and I know of cases that bringing in individual payments has led to some social disruption. So that is a concern. There are experiments done, not by me, but by other people in the field where they use other types of payments like gunpowder or some products that are more valuable for rural communities. In the Port of Mars, they don't earn money, but they can earn, say, meeting an astronaut or getting some meteor fragments. So they are kind of more kind of unique things because we don't want to provide a problem. If you whatever you provide as incentive, you may get people just being there for the money, just for the extra credit. So that's And I think that's inherently with these kind of artificial situations. You provide an incentive, and that may attract a certain type of play, and so that's why some people are trying to study different type of incentives. But it's difficult to with animals, they provide different type of food and provide food at different times. So that's difficult to do with humans, although there are these marshmallow experiments. Yeah, for humans, money is the key factor used as incentive. I've seen there are studies of web-based experiments where they also have now testing about, can you do experiments without monetary payments, and do you get the same kind of results as the standard experiments? And that's so far the findings are like that, because people have a certain way of making decisions. So
And just to follow on that, there are some interesting studies on how financialization as a phenomenon has really infused the puzzle so greatly that, you know, underneath that is this assumption that resources are convex, or there's a scarcity law, and then that may not be true. Well, that's probably not true of all social value, right? So there's that aspect too of this problem.
Yes.
I have a quick question, Marco, and kind of brought up by your last study in India, where you're trying to expand the results of some of the experiments in participatory modeling to more at a larger scale. So how scalable do you think the findings are in the experiments you talked about in the first part? I mean, they're really fascinating, but they're also done with very small numbers of people, or small groups, or in small societies. Do you think they scale well or not, or do you have any sense of this?
Oh, they will not scale well. Although I just saw yesterday a study where they have done public good experiments with 100 people, and they found very similar results than with small groups. The idea of these experiments in India is not about what happens in the experiment. It's not relevant. It's what happens after it, and people start discussing and related to their own context. And in the beginning, we wanted to know what happens in the game, but that's not the key. And all these experiments are done with small scale rural communities. Typically, there are 100 to 200 people living in a community like that. And so this is the kind of, and there are hundred thousands of those communities. So if we can reach just, if we can make this a part of the common tool for kind of a lot of the extension offices, instead of imposing solutions, technical solutions, that they use these games as a way to facilitate discussions, then that is scalable. And that's part of our kind of interest to see how can this be scaled up. Also, that it doesn't have to be that also the facilitation can be done by other people than the current NGO, because that's a challenge too, because it's you have to be well trained in facilitation and not imposing, like a lot of extension officers may like to do, particular values. So, but the initial experiments where we did groups of 4 or 5, it's that's not really scalable. I don't think that that's part of our study with the Port of Mars. One of the ideas that we could go to bigger groups if we get a large number of participants. There are studies who say that the optimal size is around 12, but there's not much work done because it's very hard to have large number of large groups in experiments.
Thanks. We're a bit over, but if anyone, I think if anyone else has a question, maybe we can do one more. Any other questions out there? Okay, well, thanks very much, Marco. Let everybody go to lunch and see you all. Do we have another talk coming up, Trish? Are we supposed to list another talk? Or are we done with these?
This is the last one for this semester.
Okay.
Stay
Well,
tuned for spring.
We will resume more in the spring semester. Thank you all for attending these. Hope you found them interesting and informative. And we'll see you. Have a good weekend, and we'll see you all next semester.
Thank you.